It's been said that to question well is to teach well. I mean, think back to all of the best teachers you've ever had, whether in school or some other extracurricular activity or even a hobby. Chances are they didn't really primarily just give you pat answers. More than anything, they probably taught you how to ask the best questions. In the Gospels, Jesus is asked directly a question more than 180 times, and he gives an immediate, direct, pat answer back only 3 of those times. And in the same Gospels, Jesus asks well over 300 questions, often in response to a question that's been asked of him. Jesus doesn't give us a whole lot of pat, simple, packaged answers. More than anything, Jesus asks us questions. This is the sort of teacher Jesus is. At Westgate, if you've been around for any length of time, you're probably familiar with the fact that our highest value is what we call 640 life, based on Luke chapter 6, verse 40, which tells us that when we are fully trained, we will become like our teacher. That's why we exist, to become students, to be apprentices, practitioners of the way of Jesus, our teacher. And so for the next few weeks, as we learn to become more like Jesus, learning his ways and living his ways, we are going to explore a series of vitally important questions that Jesus asks of us in the Gospels. And today, we begin with what is probably the most essential question. Who is Jesus? In Matthew chapter 16, the story tells us this. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And they replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Let's pause there for a moment. When Jesus asks at Caesarea Philippi, we'll come back to that in a moment, when he asks, who do people say the Son of Man is? The Son of Man is this cryptic phrase that was a go-to favorite of Jesus. He uses the phrase to describe himself more than 80 times in the Gospels. It's a phrase that was very common in the Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, particularly in Ezekiel, where it usually just means human being. But then there are passages like Daniel chapter 7, another Old Testament text, where the Son of Man is used to describe one who would come, one who was promised by God, a divine figure who would come to bring peace and restoration. And so the phrase Son of Man is really cryptic and it has a broad spectrum of meaning, and it's a bit confusing, and that's the word, the phrase Jesus uses to describe himself. And so the disciples answer, well, people say you're all sorts of things, different prophets, in fact. And then Jesus says again, well, who do you say? Who do you say I am? Now, a little bit of background here. The story tells us that Jesus and his disciples have this conversation, that Jesus asks the question, who do you say I am, while they arrive at a place called Caesarea Philippi. About 15 years before the birth of Jesus, Caesar Augustus, Caesar is a title that simply means emperor. Augustus was his adopted name. So the emperor of the Roman Empire, Caesar Augustus, about 15 years before the birth of Jesus, gives a city called Paneas to King Herod. This is the same King Herod that we read about in the Christmas story. And King Herod, in turn, gives this city called Paneas to his son, Herod Philip, for his birthday. It's a birthday gift. Here's a city, son. And Herod Philip then, in turn, builds a temple dedicated to Caesar Augustus at Paneas, and he renames the city in honor of Caesar, the emperor of Rome, and himself into Caesarea Philippi. And so this is the place where Jesus and his disciples arrive, where Jesus asks the question, who do you say I am? Now, the original name of the city, Paneas, was actually a name that was dedicated to a Greek god called Pan. And Pan was the god of mischief and trickery and perpetual immaturity. In fact, the children's character Peter Pan is named after this god, Pan. And in Paneas, now Caesarea Philippi, there was actually a large grotto, an adorned cave, where people in the city would gather to worship the god Pan. And so think about where Jesus and his disciples are. Caesarea Philippi is a place with a temple dedicated to the worship of the King of Rome, the Emperor of Rome, Caesar, and a grotto, an adorned cave dedicated to the worship of Pan, this god of Greek mythology. Caesarea Philippi is a place of idolatry. It's a location that tells people a particular story about who rules the world and what sort of world this is. And against this backdrop, Jesus asks the question, who do you say I am? I believe Jesus is asking us, you and I, a similar question against a similar backdrop. Now, certainly, we don't typically worship kings and emperors in temples anymore. We don't worship the gods of Greek mythology in caves and grottos. But make no mistake, idolatry is still all around us. It's just that our idolatry today in 2020 is a bit more sophisticated, a bit more modern. Tim Keller puts it this way. He says that an idol is anything more important to you than God, anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God, anything you seek to give you what only God can give. Is there anything more important to you than God? Honestly. Is there anything that has absorbed your heart and your imagination more than God? Is there anything that we seek to satisfy our souls more than God? These are the idols in our midst. Maybe it's success that is most important to us. Or maybe it's acceptance or a particular relationship that absorbs our hearts and our imaginations. Maybe it's power or control or security that we seek to satisfy our souls. In the midst of these idols and so many others, Jesus is asking you and me today, who do you say I am? The story continues in Matthew chapter 16, and as Jesus asks the disciples the question, who do you say I am? Simon, Peter, responds. He makes this incredible declaration. He says, Jesus, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. There's a lot to say here, but for sake of time and for the question we want to answer today, let's focus on one key word in that response, that declaration from Simon Peter, Messiah. What does that word mean? In the original language of the text, Koine Greek, it's actually the Greek word Christos, from which we get the English word Christ. And Christ, Christos, is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Meshiach, from which we get the English word Messiah. So Christ is not Jesus' last name, it's a title. It's a title that means Messiah. Messiah and Christ can be used interchangeably. And often it is, depending on the translation of the Bible that you look at, Christ and Messiah. Now, both of those words, Christos and Mashiach, Christ and Messiah, they mean something very specific. Those words mean anointed one. Now, here's the thing. Anointing isn't something we do on the regular today in 2020, so it feels a bit foreign. But for us to really grasp Peter's declaration, the response to the question, who do you say I am, we have to go back in time just a little bit, actually quite a lot, to the very beginning. Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3. At the very beginning of time, the story tells us that God creates a good world, and he creates human beings to partner with him in bringing about the potential, the good potential of that world. And everything is good until chapter 3. When Adam and Eve, the first humans, sin, that nasty three-letter word simply means to rebel against God and his plan for his glory and for our flourishing. And so sin enters the story. And the moment that sin enters the story, it fractures the story. God's good plan for a good world with human beings at the center of relationship with Him is fractured. And yet, God doesn't give up on the story. Right there in Genesis chapter 3, as sin enters the human story, God promises that someday He is going to make things right again. And He does so by promising a particular individual that He will send to make all wrong things right, to bring the peace and restoration that is now needed because of human rebellion against God. And then we fast forward, and God makes a promise to a man named Abraham. And He tells Abraham, listen, I am going to give you many descendants, and your descendants are going to become a nation, and that nation will be my chosen people, blessed by me in order to be a blessing to the world. And then a few generations later, God makes another more specific promise to Abraham's great-grandson, a man named Judah. And God tells him that from his lineage will come a king. And that king would be the one that was promised by God since the beginning to again bring peace and restoration and healing and mending to the fractured human story. And so, very shortly after, we begin to see a line of kings from the line of Judah. The first king is King David, that many of us know from the David and Goliath story, as well as writing many of the Psalms that we love and cherish. And while David is primarily a good king, he fails to bring fulfillment to the utter peace and restoration that God has promised. And not only David, but all of the kings in the line of Judah and all of the kings of Israel fail in that regard. Which brings us to Jesus. Finally, in the first century, Jesus enters the human story. And in this moment, Matthew chapter 16, standing in Caesarea Philippi, this place of utter idolatry, when He asks His disciples the question, "Who do you say I am?" Peter's declaration that Jesus, you are the Messiah, what it means is, Jesus, you are the anointed one. Literally, that is what the word means. Messiah, Christ, the anointed one. Because kings were literally anointed with oil, typically by the prophets. And so for Peter to declare to Jesus, you are the Messiah, you are the Christ, you are the anointed one, this is Peter's declaration that he believes, moved by the Spirit of God within him, that Jesus is finally the promised King who has come to usher in full, the peace and the restoration that they've been longing for and waiting for. When Jesus asks, "Who do you say I am?" the response is, you are the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one, the one we've been waiting for. You and I, today, are all in some ways living in this waiting. And honestly, as we wait, we often grasp at the idols in our midst. We reach for achievement and success to bring us joy. We often find ourselves reaching for particular sorts of acceptance or a particular relationship to bring us meaning. We reach for power or control or security to bring us peace. But in our reaching, just like back then, standing in Caesarea Philippi, surrounded by the idols of our day, we are once again asked this question by Jesus: who do you say I am? Who do you say Jesus is in the midst of your longing and your searching? Who do you say Jesus is in the midst of your doubt and your confusion? Who do you say Jesus is in the midst of your loneliness and despair and pain and shame and guilt? Whether you are a follower of Jesus or not, and I know that most of us watching and listening would say, yeah, I am a Christian. But I know that there are many of us watching who are on the fence. Maybe we're just exploring faith, or we're brand new to faith, or we're just checking things out. We wouldn't consider ourselves Christians per se, certainly not followers of Jesus. I want to ask you a question. on the off chance that Jesus was right, on the off chance that he was actually telling the truth, that he really is the Messiah, the anointed one, the promised king who has come to bring peace and restoration, is it not a worthwhile endeavor to at least ask the questions more deeply? I want to give you one practical tip. If you are exploring faith or you're new to faith and you're just trying to figure all of this out, if you are actually genuinely asking the question, man, I don't know, who is Jesus? And how can I have faith and trust and confidence that he is who he says he is? I just want to share one opportunity with you. At Westgate, we offer a course called Alpha every year throughout the year. And the most recent course just started, but we offer them throughout the year. And so Alpha is a safe place for skeptics and for those who are searching to come and ask all of those questions, to dive deep into the story of Jesus and to discover there whether or not this whole Jesus thing is actually true. And so if you're interested in that, if you are exploring faith or you're brand new to faith or you consider yourself a skeptic or you have questions, I would encourage you just email 640@westgatechurch.org, 640@westgatechurch.org, and we would love to connect with you and respond to some of your questions and get you plugged into an Alpha course when you're ready to do that. Now, as we wind down, 12 chapters earlier in the Gospel according to Matthew, right as Jesus is beginning his earthly ministry, like literally at the beginning of Jesus' ministry in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew quotes, the writer Matthew, he quotes this ancient prophetic text about the coming Messiah found in Isaiah chapter 9. And he says this in Matthew 4, "The people living in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned." This is, again, an ancient text from an ancient prophetic book called Isaiah, and this particular text is a text that was pointing people to the future hope of the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one, the King God would send to usher in his peace and restoration. Let me read it again. "The people living in darkness have seen a great light, and on those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned." So whether you're exploring faith or you're brand new to faith or you've been a Christian for many years, the darkness of life and the shadows of death can so often blind us to this incredible and all-important truth that light has come. Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one, the King. A couple of years ago, when my daughter had just turned 3, she was enrolled in preschool. And so most mornings, I would shuffle her into my car and I would drive her to school. And most of our drives to school, we would listen to this Spotify worship playlist that was curated by somebody. And she was 3, so she didn't really understand the depths of these songs, but she liked the melodies. And so she would learn the words and sing along on our drives to school. And there was one song in particular that she loved for a season, and over again, she would ask me to play the song on repeat. I want to read for you some of the lyrics to that song that my 3-year-old sang over and over in the car for many months. It says that Jesus, you make the darkness tremble, and you silence fear. Your name is a name, it's a light that the shadows can't deny. And your name cannot be overcome. And so over and over again on our drives to school, she would just hum along and sing these words without having any idea what they meant. Jesus, you make the darkness tremble, you silence fear. Your name is a name that is a light that the shadows can't deny, and your name cannot be overcome. And I used to chuckle watching my 3-year-old sing these incredibly powerful, prophetic, biblical lyrics without having any idea what they meant. And then one night, in the middle of the night, I heard her crying in her room, just wailing. So I went to her room and I held my little girl in my arms and I asked her what was wrong. And she said, "Daddy, I'm scared. I had a bad dream and I'm scared of the dark." And so the thought came to me. I said, "Harper, that song we always sing in the car, what does the song tell us?" She said, "Daddy, I don't know." I said, "Well, babe, let's sing it together." And I held my 3-year-old daughter in my arms in the darkness and in the silence. And we sang those words together. Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. You silence fear. Your name is a light that the shadows cannot deny. Your name cannot be overcome. And I watched my 3-year-old go from understanding Jesus as simply a lyric in a song to opening up to the possibility that he was something more, that he was actually light that could pierce the darkness, silence the fear, and overcome even the dark shadows that loom above. Maybe Jesus is just a lyric in a song to you. Maybe Jesus is a significant historical figure or a great moral teacher. But in the darkness of our lives, as the shadows loom, I would encourage you to open your heart and your mind once again to hear Christ asking you the question, who do you really say I am? Because it is in answering that question, in recognizing that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One, the King who was promised to bring peace and restoration and to the brokenness of our lives and our world. It is in recognizing that Jesus is the light that makes the darkness tremble, that silences fear, that the shadows cannot deny. It is in recognizing and responding to that question that all the other questions of life find their resolve and their resolution.